Buildings do not change easily, and the building that sits at the center of British public life, the one whose name has become shorthand for the entire institution of monarchy, is in many ways the least easily changed building in the country. It has stood in its current form for the better part of 2 centuries, and the institution it houses has occupied some form of royal residence on that site for considerably longer than that. The stone and the gilt and the vast accumulated weight of ceremony that the building represents are not designed to change quickly, are not designed to adapt readily to shifting circumstances, are designed, if anything, to project exactly the opposite quality, permanence, stability, the sense that whatever else changes in the world outside the gates, this particular institution and this particular building will remain essentially as they have always been. And yet change is coming to Buckingham Palace in ways that go beyond the literal scaffolding that has covered significant portions of the building during its long-running renovation program. Change that touches the institution's structure and its culture and its relationship with the public it serves. Change that the building's apparent permanence cannot prevent, and that the institution's historical resistance to transformation is finding increasingly difficult to resist or to manage on its own terms. The literal renovation of Buckingham Palace, the 10-year program of essential maintenance and modernization that has been underway for several years now, is itself a useful starting point for understanding the broader story of institutional change, because it illustrates something important about how change happens to institutions that are simultaneously deeply resistant to it and genuinely unable to avoid it. The palace's infrastructure, the wiring and the plumbing and the heating systems that lie beneath the historic fabric of the building, had reached a point of genuine deterioration that could no longer be managed through the kind of incremental patching that had characterized previous decades of maintenance. The choice the institution faced was not between change and no change. It was between a managed and deliberate process of renewal, undertaken on terms the institution could at least partially control, or an eventual crisis of infrastructure failure that would force change in a far less controlled and far more damaging way. The institution chose the former, and the choice itself reveals something about how institutions of this kind actually approach change when they cannot avoid it entirely, reluctantly, gradually, and always within a framework designed to preserve as much of the existing structure as possible, while addressing only what has become genuinely unavoidable. This pattern, change accepted only when avoidance becomes impossible, and pursued always with maximum preservation of existing structure, is visible not just in the literal renovation of the building, but in almost every dimension of the institutional change that Buckingham Palace and the monarchy more broadly are currently navigating. The financial pressures that have made the cost of the institution a more prominent subject of public debate than it has been for generations are forcing conversations about funding and accountability that the institution would never have initiated on its own, conversations about the sovereign grant and its calculation, about the income from the Crown estate, and how the public benefits from arrangements that have historically been structured to maximize institutional benefit while minimizing public scrutiny, about the broader question of whether the current model of royal funding represents appropriate value and appropriate transparency for a modern democracy. These conversations are happening, and they are producing some genuine change, incremental adjustments to disclosure and to the framing of royal finances that represent real, if modest, movement toward greater accountability. But the change is happening at the pace and to the degree that external pressure forces, not at the pace and to the degree that genuine institutional conviction about the value of transparency would produce, if that conviction existed independently of external pressure. The future shape of the working royal family, The question of how many people will occupy formal public roles and what those roles will actually involve is one of the dimensions of change that has been most visibly forced upon the institution by circumstances rather than chosen as a matter of strategic preference. The departure of Harry and Meghan removed two people who would, in different circumstances, have been part of the working structure for decades to come. The health challenges affecting senior working royals have further reduced the operational capacity available to the institution at precisely the moment when that capacity was already under strain. The result is an institution that is operating with a significantly smaller working base than it had even a decade ago. And the question of whether this smaller base represents a temporary contraction that will eventually be reversed as health improves and family relationships potentially heal, or whether it represents a permanent and perhaps even strategically desirable right-sizing of an institution that had, by some assessments, become too large and too expensive relative to the genuine public value it was providing, is a question that the institution has not yet definitively answered, and that its eventual answer will significantly shape the future structure of royal life. There are indications from various sources connected to the institution and from the public statements of senior royals themselves that there is a genuine strategic preference within at least some parts of the institution for a smaller and more focused working royal family going forward. A model sometimes described in terms of quality over quantity, a smaller group of family members undertaking a more concentrated and more carefully chosen set of public engagements, rather than the broader and more diffuse approach that characterized previous generations. This preference, if it genuinely reflects the direction the institution intends to take, rather than simply a retrospective justification for changes that circumstances forced upon it, would represent a genuinely significant shift in how the monarchy understands its own scale and its own relationship with the public. A shift toward a model that may be more sustainable, more easily justified in terms of cost and value, and more aligned with the kind of institution that a country with changing attitudes toward inherited privilege and public funding might find more acceptable going forward. The future of royal communications and royal transparency represents another dimension where change is visibly underway, even if the change remains incomplete relative to what full transparency would actually require. The shift toward more direct and more personal communication, exemplified by the way health matters have been discussed in recent years compared to the deeply guarded approach of previous generations, by the more frequent use of video messages and direct-to-camera communication rather than formal written statements issued through intermediaries, by the increased presence of senior royals on social media platforms, speaking in voices that are at least somewhat more personal and less formally institutional than previous generations of royal communication. All of this represents genuine change in the direction of a more accessible and more relatable royal communication style. Whether this change extends to the kind of substantive transparency that the institution's most serious critics are calling for, transparency about finances, about internal culture, about the specific institutional failures that have been described by people who have left royal life and spoken about their experiences, is a separate and more difficult question. And the evidence so far suggests that the change in communication style has significantly outpaced any change in substantive transparency about the institution's actual internal workings and actual internal accountability. The future relationship between the monarchy and the multiple nations across the world that retain the British monarch as their head of state is one of the dimensions of change that is least within the institution's direct control, and that may, over the coming years and decades, produce some of the most significant alterations to the monarchy's actual scope and actual significance. Several countries within the Commonwealth realms have already moved toward becoming republics, removing the British monarch as their head of state and several others have active and increasingly mainstream political movements pursuing the same outcome. This is not a process that Buckingham Palace can prevent because the decision belongs constitutionally and democratically to the people and governments of the countries concerned, and the institution's role in this process is necessarily passive, a matter of accepting and adapting to decisions made elsewhere rather than actively shaping them. The future scope of the monarchy, in terms of how many nations it actually represents as head of state, is likely to be smaller in coming decades than it has been, and this gradual contraction, while not existentially threatening to the monarchy's position in the United Kingdom itself, represents a genuine and significant change to the institution's international significance and international role. The future of the relationship between the monarchy and younger generations within the United Kingdom itself is, in many ways, the most consequential dimension of change that the institution is navigating, because it will determine whether the monarchy retains the kind of broad-based public support and public relevance that has historically justified its continued existence, or whether it gradually becomes an institution whose support is concentrated primarily among older demographics in a pattern that, if it continues across additional generations, would eventually threaten the institution's basic sustainability. The institution's efforts to address this challenge, through more contemporary forms of public engagement, through causes and initiatives that are intended to resonate with younger audiences, through the cultivation of a more accessible and more relatable public image for the younger generation of royals, represent genuine attempts to adapt to this generational challenge. But the underlying skepticism that defines younger generations' relationship with institutional authority of every kind, not just the monarchy specifically, is a cultural and generational phenomenon that the institution's specific initiatives can only partially address. Because the skepticism is not primarily a response to specific royal behaviors that better behavior could fully resolve, but a broader generational orientation toward institutions in general that the monarchy, however it adapts, will have to continue navigating rather than ever fully resolving. The future of the institution's relationship with questions of historical accountability, particularly around the legacy of empire and colonialism, represents a dimension of change that the institution has approached with extreme caution, and that remains one of the least resolved aspects of its broader adaptation to a changing world. There have been gestures, expressions of sorrow during state visits to countries with significant colonial history, acknowledgments that the historical relationship between the crown and various nations and peoples around the world included injustices that deserve recognition. But these gestures have consistently stopped short of the kind of full and explicit accountability, including the question of reparations and the question of formal apology, that many of the communities and nations most directly affected by colonial history have called for. The future trajectory of this dimension of institutional change is genuinely uncertain because it touches on questions that go to the heart of how the institution understands its own history and its own legitimacy. And the institution's evident reluctance to engage more fully with this accountability suggests that whatever change does eventually occur in this area is likely to come slowly and incrementally, driven by continued external pressure rather than by any internal institutional initiative to address the question more directly and more completely. The future of the family relationships at the center of the institution. The question of whether the significant fractures of recent years will eventually heal in ways that allow for a more unified public presentation of the royal family, or whether the current period of visible division represents a more permanent feature of the institution's future, is a dimension of change or potential change that remains genuinely unpredictable, dependent as it is on personal and relational dynamics that institutional strategy cannot fully control or determine. The specific structural conditions that have made repair so difficult, discussed extensively elsewhere in terms of the different positions occupied by the various parties, and the public documentation that has made certain accounts permanently part of the record, are not conditions that are likely to simply resolve themselves with the passage of time. Whether the institution's future includes a genuinely reconciled family, presenting a unified public face that reflects underlying reality rather than simply managed presentation, or whether it includes a continued and perhaps permanent state of visible division, managed but not resolved, is one of the most significant open questions about what Buckingham Palace's changing future will actually look like. The future leadership of the institution, the eventual transition from the current reign to the next, carries with it the possibility of more significant change than incremental adaptation within the current reign has been able to produce, because a new monarch brings with them not just a new individual personality, but a new opportunity to reset aspects of institutional approach and institutional culture that the continuity of an existing reign makes more difficult to alter. The indications available about how the next reign might approach the question of institutional change, indications drawn from the public statements and the apparent priorities of the heir during his current period as Prince of Wales, suggest a potential orientation toward a smaller, more focused, and perhaps somewhat more transparent institution than the current model represents, though the actual implementation of any such vision will depend significantly on circumstances and pressures that cannot be fully anticipated from the current vantage point. What does the totality of all these dimensions of change suggest about the actual future of Buckingham Palace as an institution as opposed to simply as a building? It suggests an institution that is changing, genuinely, and in ways that go beyond mere cosmetic adjustment, but that is changing more slowly and more incompletely than the scale of the pressures it faces might seem to require, an institution whose changes are consistently reactive rather than proactive, driven by external pressure and unavoidable circumstance rather than by genuine internal conviction about the value of transformation for its own sake. This pattern of reluctant, incremental, externally driven change is not necessarily a recipe for institutional failure. Many institutions have successfully navigated long periods of gradual adaptation without the kind of dramatic, proactive transformation that more idealistic observers might prefer, and there is a reasonable argument that an institution whose entire value proposition rests significantly on continuity and tradition is wise to change as slowly and as cautiously as circumstances allow, preserving as much of its essential character as possible while making only the adjustments that have become genuinely unavoidable. But this pattern is also not without genuine risk, because the pressures driving the need for change, the generational shift in attitudes, the changed information environment, the questions about finance and accountability and historical legacy are not pressures that are likely to diminish over time without genuine institutional response. An institution that continues to change only as much and only as quickly as external pressure forces, rather than getting ahead of the pressures it faces through more proactive and more substantial transformation, risks finding itself perpetually behind the pace of change that its own survival actually requires, always catching up to yesterday's pressure rather than anticipating tomorrow's, and the gap between the institution's actual rate of change and the rate of change that genuine long-term sustainability might require is one of the most significant uncertainties hanging over Buckingham Palace's future. What happens inside those walls in the years and decades ahead, what the institution becomes as it continues to navigate all of these dimensions of pressure and change, is not yet determined, and it will not be determined by any single decision or any single moment, but by the accumulated effect of thousands of individual choices made by the people who currently lead the institution and by the people who will eventually succeed them. The building itself, undergoing its careful and deliberate renovation stone by stone and system by system, preserved in its essential historic character while updated in its essential infrastructure, offers perhaps the most honest metaphor available for understanding how the institution it houses is approaching its own necessary transformation. Change accepted, but change always undertaken with maximum preservation of the existing structure. Change that addresses what has become genuinely unavoidable while resisting, as long as possible, anything that goes beyond that necessary minimum. Whether this approach will prove sufficient for the scale of change that the institution's actual future requires is the question that the coming years will answer, inside walls that have stood for centuries and that are now, slowly and reluctantly, learning to change.